So hi, my name is Stephane Kasriel. I've been involved in two-sided platforms, networks, and marketplaces for most of my career. Most recently, I was the CEO of Upwork, the world's largest marketplace for freelance work. And the organizers of the conference asked me to talk about some real-life examples of things that we've gone through. And the point of this is to illustrate what people call market design. So let me start with the myth of how marketplaces are built. Step one, you find product market fit. Step two, you do things that don't scale and you reach liquidity. Step three, powerful network effects kick in. The magic hand of Adam Smith makes everything perfect. And step four, your business grows exponentially with no supervision at all, and you're just enjoying life on the beach. And I can tell you, I've been involved with Upwork for the last 8 years and seen it grow almost 10x during that period. Step four never happens. And so a lot of things have been said about network effects and how powerful they have been. I think less has been said about the art and science of market design. So let me explain what market design means. There's a relatively small group of economists that are crafting this idea of market design, and it's really the intersection of game theory. You know, everybody's in it for themselves. Everybody will try to find loopholes in your rules. Whatever processes and policies you've designed, you need to think about the unintended consequences and how people will change their behaviors accordingly. So that's one, game theory. The second one is auction theory, and auction theory does not apply to every marketplace, but if there's a bidding system where buyers and sellers are somehow competing for time or money on the site, then auction theory typically has an impact. So who pays the fees? What types of auctions do you put in place? Are there constraints around time, et cetera, et cetera? And then the third piece of market design is behavioral economics. And the idea being that we're not perfectly rational, neither the buyers nor the sellers, irrespective of whether you're running a B2C website, like most marketplaces are, or a B2B website, like the one that Upwork is running. People behave in irrational ways, but they behave in predictable, irrational ways. And if you get under their skin and understand how people are going to react, not only with rational thoughts, but also with emotion, you're able to design a better marketplace. So really the idea of market design is trying to combine game theory, auction theory, behavioral economics as a way for you as the operator of the marketplace to design an outcome that is better than what would happen otherwise. And the idea is to, use those mechanisms to create policies, to create incentives for all network participants to behave in ways that you consider to be optimal. And obviously optimal is something that you need to define. There's quite a bit of literature on this stuff. I would say if you just want an introduction to this, there's a professor called Alvin E. Roth, who wrote a book called Who Gets What and Why, among other things. There's also a very long HBR study on it. And that gives you some illustration of some of the concepts. But I just thought I would not spare you the theory. I'm not an economist, and just give you some concrete examples of things that we've gone through at Upwork and that potentially resonate with you, maybe things that you're also seeing, or maybe things that you'll get into at some point. So let me start with the first one, which is to illustrate the idea of positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. So the obvious positive feedback loop that everybody always talks about is when you get more buyers, you get more sellers. When you get more sellers, you get more buyers, and everything is beautiful. Let me give you an example of a negative feedback loop. And this goes back to Upwork several years ago. On any given day, we would have something like 5,000 freelancers trying to sign up every single day. Obviously, if you do the math, we did not have enough work for 5,000 new people every single day, in addition to all of the people who had signed up before. And at the time, the idea of the company was really this idea of the magic hand of Adam Smith. Let the supply and demand meet each other and everything is going to be amazing. And the reality was, in that world, it would take well over 100 bids for a freelancer to win one job. So 99% of the time, you would get rejected. 1% of the time, you got hired. The challenge with that is that really, really good freelancers almost always have a choice. You can work on Upwork, but you can find your own clients. There are competing platforms out there. You could just drop out of the freelance economy, get a full-time job. And so fundamentally, when it's too hard for people to get jobs, the best freelancers who have a choice give up. The ones who quote unquote survive in the marketplace tend to be the ones that are that have the fewer alternative options, and they tend to be the ones that are lesser skilled. And at that point, they're sufficiently desperate, they're almost willing to work for free. So not only is it hard to find work on the platform, but also the rates are extremely low. And this puts downward pressure on the rates, even for the best freelancers who exit the platform. And at that point, the best clients who like to work with the best freelancers also leave the platform. So instead of having this positive feedback reinforcement cycle, you have this negative reinforcement cycle where quality goes down, rates go down, and the situation just keeps getting worse. So what did we do? We changed the marketplace so that you cannot sign up to be a freelancer on Upwork. You apply to join. So when you first join the platform, you create a profile, you submit it for review, and the system will decide whether A, we think you're qualified for the work that you want to do, and B, whether there's enough demand and there's enough balance between supply and demand to let you in. Obviously, that's done automatically through algorithms, given that it's thousands and thousands of people a day. We couldn't have human recruiters do it, but the idea is the same, which is to really only let you in if it's not going to result in kicking out somebody else who's already present on the platform. And as a result, more than 90% of freelancers who try to sign up and apply to get admitted actually don't get in. And it's purely because there's just not enough jobs on the platform. But the outcome of this is that now the platform is a lot stickier. 50% of the spend on the platform, the earnings of freelancers on the platform goes to freelancers who've been on the site for 3 years or more. And so this race to the bottom, if you will, has disappeared through this market design that we've put in place. Let me give you another example. So example 2 is the intended user versus the fraudster. We as product managers and marketplace designers, we tend to think of the happy path, all the amazing people that we're going to be enabling through our platform. And if you really want to make them really happy, you want to remove friction. Anything that you do that induces friction will reduce conversion rate, will make people upset, which will reduce your net promoter score. And so all of these things are things you're trying to avoid. Unfortunately, they don't just help the good people, they also help the fraudsters. And so one example of something that has happened over the years at Upwork is we've progressively increased the number of people that need to be ID verified, where we literally check a national issued identity document and potentially have them show up on a webcam to prove that they are the person who they say they are, and even potentially do it regularly so that if they're renting or selling their accounts, they can get away with it easily. And so the idea here is by doing this, you are upsetting some very legitimate users. You're actually losing some good customers, but you're also removing a meaningful amount of fraud, which doesn't just hurt the company itself, it also hurts the other side. So bad freelancers will hurt the clients, bad clients will hurt the freelancers. And you want to design these things in a way that the false positives don't outweigh the false negatives, meaning you're not irritating more really, really good people compared to removing the amount of fraud. But that's another example of market design where you build those policies, you build those processes, having in mind not just the intended users for the platform, but also all of the unintended consequences of what you've built. The third example is what happens with matching. And so at scale, people make it a living to quote unquote SEO themselves into your search engine. Every freelancer on Upwork wants to be at the top of search results. And there's a real challenge with a marketplace search versus maybe a Google search. If the same page shows up at the top of Google search all the time, that's not an issue. Maybe the server of that page will crash, but generally it's an infinite resource. When a seller on your marketplace shows up at the top of search results every single time, the problem is that seller may have limited capacity. And in the case of Upwork, you sell your time. Most people can only work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And so at some point, if you show up too much at the top of search results, you're not going to be able to fulfill the demand, and you're taking work away from somebody else who has extra capacity and has the skills to do it. And so the challenge there is, if you ask people, do you want to be at the top of search results? Everybody will say yes, because of course there's no downside. If you say, can you please share with us your availability? Like when do you think you'll have extra bandwidth? Put you at the top of search results then, but don't put you at the top of search results if you don't have extra capacity. And wrong incentives. You're the freelancer. You say, well, there's no downside. I'm going to tell you that I'm available all the time, and I'm just going to cherry pick the clients that I'm interested in. And so the challenge is, how do you get people to truthfully give you a signal, to really tell you when they are looking for more work, but also when they're not looking for more work? And one thing that we've talked about for a long, long time and still does not fully exist on the platform today is the idea of paying for placement. Obviously, a well-known monetization mechanism that is essentially how Google makes money, but we were not planning to do this as a monetization where it's not meant to be increasing the take rate or increasing the revenue. It's meant to keep people honest when they say they need extra work. If it doesn't cost you anything, you're always going to say yes. If it costs you something, even if that thing might be very nominal, you might be a little bit more careful. And in turn, that gives the algorithm a better signal, which allows us to improve the search ranking algorithms. And the lesson here is, even the good participants, not just the fraudsters, everybody's in it for themselves. And so you have to use game theory and tools, things like wargaming and scenario planning and talking with your community to really understand how participants will change their behavior based on changes that you're introducing so that you can optimize the outcome. Let me give you a fourth example, which is somewhat counterintuitive. And that's one of the things that I think makes marketplaces fascinating. It's when you do something that's hard to predict and has unintended consequences. So about 7 years ago at Upwork, we decided that we should have a minimum rate on the platform. Theoretically, there are countries where the minimum wage, even for highly skilled individuals, might be sub $1 an hour. And we just felt that this was giving a really good bargain to the buyers, but really at the expense of the freelancers, and in particular, the freelancers in countries like the US, where the cost of living is high and the prevailing wages are high as well. And so the idea was, well, very simple. Let's introduce a minimum rate. Let's just say nobody can make less than X on the platform. And obviously, the obvious outcome of this is the stated outcome, which is nobody makes less than X on the platform. The unintended consequences, and there were two. One is the hourly rates on the platform did go up. So obviously people that were making less than the minimum rate could not bid at that level anymore. So it did increase rates. But the average job size actually went down. And what happened is the freelancers who were less productive either became productive or left the platform. And they were replaced with freelancers who had a higher hourly rate, but were also more productive, which allowed them to do the work in less hours. And the net was the actual job size did not increase. A potential different way of analyzing it, of seeing it is freelancers were padding their hours. They were saying, sure, I'll work for X, but really I'm going to be cheating a little bit and pretend to be working more hours. But either way, the average job size did not actually go up as a result of this. The other thing that is somewhat hard to predict was there are two types of jobs on Upwork: fixed price jobs and hourly jobs. And the people that were willing to pay the higher wages continued to use hourly work. The people that were not willing to pay the higher wages, now that we had put a limit, had changed their jobs to being fixed price jobs, essentially bypassing the limit that we had put in place. So again, these are things that, hindsight is 2020. 7 years later, I can, explain this as if it was completely obvious. At the time when we designed these things, we had no idea that this was going to happen. And frankly, the experiment as a result did not reach the outcomes that we were planning to get from there. And so the point of all of this is that the magic hand of Adam Smith does not always lead to a desirable outcome, and it does not lead to the optimum equilibrium that you want to design for your marketplace. Every marketplace participant, and that includes you as the owner of the marketplace, is in it for themselves. And that includes both the desired participants, the people that you think that you're targeting, the unintended but good participants, people that you didn't know existed, but they're still using your platform in ways that might be very different from what you expected. And then the undesirable participants, the fraudsters on both sides of the marketplace, potentially colluding with themselves to defraud you or defraud the owners of the payment methods. And so as operators of marketplaces, you get to create policies, you get to define processes to improve the equilibrium, often by trial and error. But in order to reduce the amount of error and the number of trials, you use the techniques of market design to do this more systematically, to simulate what's going to happen, and to have a higher hit rate on the experiments that you run. And that's pretty much it. There's no like magic to it. It's a lot of blocking and tackling. It's a lot of simulation and just thinking about what might happen if you build the policies that you think you're going to be building. And with that, I see a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to read the questions. And if I'm missing one that you really want to see answered, please ask it again. So from the last one to the next one, is the turnover on the talent side high? How do you drive more loyalty? So I mentioned that half of the business on Upwork is done by freelancers who have been on the platform for more than 3 years. So it is a platform with high loyalty for a relatively small subset of the overall users. And Upwork has multiple programs, but one of them, the ones that's the most visible on the site, is called top-rated freelancers. And top-rated freelancers, there's a few tens of thousands in the world. They tend to make a meaningful part of their income, or potentially all of their income, through Upwork. And they've typically been on the platform for multiple years. That being said, the other half is done by freelancers that come in and out. And in many cases, it's because of life situation. Not everybody wants to be a freelancer full time. Lots of people do this in between two jobs while they have care duties at home, or while they've been relocated to a part of the country where there's no jobs, and they are planning to go in and out of freelancing over their career. So Joe's question is, being that having a minimum hourly rate had any unexpected, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? That's a really good question. And let me ask maybe a slightly different question, which is, I think, a hot topic right now, while everybody is fully distributed and everybody is working remote. The question of how should pricing be thought of in a place where the cost of living for people is radically different. So if you take Upwork as an example, Upwork as a company, it's about 2,000 people, most of whom are freelancers working through Upwork, and they're everywhere in the world, like people in India, people in Pakistan, people in Australia, people in Chile. And obviously the cost of living is radically different for some of these people compared to some of the employees that we have in San Francisco. And so the question there is, should you pay people based on their contribution? Meaning, if you're a software developer, level 3, irrespective of where you live, you should make X. Or should you pay people based on their local alternative, which is, among other things, based on their local cost of living? And of course, the philosophical answer is A, right? Like, the right thing to do is you pay people based on what they contribute to the company. And if that means that they can't make a living in your place, then they're just not going to work for you, or they're going to relocate to another part of the world. The reality is, it doesn't, as soon as you start using a platform like Upwork, you're not a price maker, you're a price taker like everybody else. So it doesn't really matter what I think we should be paying people. Ultimately, if we want to hire people, we compete against every other client on the platform, and the market settles somewhere between those two. And it depends on the category, it depends on the relative elasticity of supply and demand. But fundamentally, if you're a data scientist in doing something that's really, really hard to find and nobody else does it, you might be living in the lowest cost geography in the world. You're going to make just as much money as if you lived in Mountain View. And conversely, if you do entry-level work that is highly commoditized and where there's an oversupply, it doesn't matter what policies we can put into place. The wages are always going to be a race to the bottom. And that's just the nature of the underlying supply and demand, which is why we have to limit the supply on the site. Upvote Marius's question. So how did you solve for rough market design criteria of congestion? Yes. So when you read some of the stuff about market design, there are topics around, for instance, early mover advantage. So things like, an example that Roth uses is the early decisioning process in college admissions in the US. Why do colleges do this? Well, they want to get the best talent locked in early so that they don't go to a competitor. The challenge with that on a site like Upwork is if you try to raise people, if you try to get people to bid on a job as quickly as possible, typically the quality of the bid is really low. So on one side, it is true that clients like to fill their jobs quickly. The median time to hire on Upwork is about 23 hours, right? So it's really good to be able to hire people fast. On the other side, the quality of the proposal that they send tends to be much lower if they are trying to answer within 5 minutes compared to if they take a couple of hours. And so finding the right balance, and it's very category specific, obviously. Like if I'm asking for a translation of a document from English to French, I don't want to see 20 people explain to me why they're highly qualified. I'd rather have one person who tends to be highly qualified just translate the document for me. Meanwhile, if I'm planning to hire somebody for the next 5 years, and I really want to make sure there's a culture fit and all that stuff, then the initial time doesn't matter as much, but the relationship I'm building with them matters a lot, right? And so finding the right mechanisms to get bids early, to get liquidity to happen quickly, but also make sure that there's a good match between the supply and demand that will result in a good outcome. Let me see if I'm missing something else here. I only have 3 more minutes, I think. So what do I think about the launch? So this is Joe's question. What do I think about the launch of managed developer marketplaces like turning.com, pullrequest.com? Will they, or are they taking jobs away from open networks like Upwork? Are they expanding the markets? That's a great question. I think in an ideal world, what I would have loved to build at Upwork, and there were so many other things to do, we never really got around to building it, was a true network that allowed other vertical marketplaces to sit on top of us. And there's been examples in the past. There was a company called ZipTask that did it. To some extent, Smith.ai does it too. But they're using the current APIs that we have, or ideally much better APIs, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of the stuff I talked about includes things like identity verification and fraud management and payments and billing in multiple countries and taxes and all sorts of things that every single one of these marketplaces needs to replicate. And unfortunately, finding the right fit where we are kind of the underlying platform and everybody else builds on top of it has been pretty challenging over the years. And so I think at this stage, it is a competition. Like we are competing, Upwork is competing against other marketplaces, vertical marketplaces for freelance talent. The reality, though, is it's $1 trillion market. Upwork is $2 billion, so it's like 0.2% of the market. There's plenty of space for everybody else, and I think it's great that there's going to be more platforms. I fully expect that with the current remote work environment, we will see tons and tons of new marketplaces for remote work, and that's amazing. There's a question. Do I have time for one more? Let me see which one I missed. There's too many questions here. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all the questions. Well, I guess I gave you just 1 minute back. I'm sorry that I don't get to see everybody, but it's good to be here. Thank you very much for your interest.